Hello, and a very good day to you on this Sunday, June 13th. Today is a very important day for Guyana. It is the day when Dr. Walter Rodney was assassinated. It was on a Friday. This year, June 13th falls on a Sunday. And whether one is a supporter of Walter Rodney or his party, or whether one agreed or agrees with his politics or not, I think all Guyanese should pause and reflect today on what Rodney represented and still represents. Because whether one believes it or not, whether one thinks that he deserves it or not, Walter Rodney stands out as one of the more important personages to have emerged from the post-colonial era in Guyana and the English-speaking Caribbean. I think the difficulty for us as a country, as a region, is to come to grips with some of our gifts to the world, because they do not always sit in the same ideological pew as most of us. The point is that our independence, like the independence of Europe or America or Africa, Latin America, has been a contested independence. Even when we were fighting against slavery or against colonialism, there were differences of opinion, differences of emphasis, difference in tactics, difference in strategies. Kofi did not always see eye to eye with Akbar. We come to the United States of America, we go to the United States of America. Du Bois and Garvey did not always see eye to eye. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington did not always see eye to eye. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had different approaches to the same outcomes. They did not always see eye to eye. And it is the same in our Guyana and our Caribbean. We've produced great men and women whose works and visions have enriched our countries, our region, and the wider world. But they did not always agree. They did not always agree. Walter Rodney is not a mystery. Walter Rodney is a product of Guyana and the English-speaking Caribbean. He was born in 1942, and so would have grown up with the independence movement. He would have been 11 when Guyana had its first election under adult suffrage, an election that produced Guyana's first homegrown government, which was overthrown by the British 133 days later, Walter Rodney would have been 11. Walter Rodney would have been 16 in 1958 when the Caribbean embarked on what is now known as the West Indies Federation, when 10 Caribbean countries came together and formed a single government, a single union. Guyana was not part of that union because the PPP government of the day felt that had Guyana become part of the federation, Indian Guyanese would have been a minority. And so they kept Guyana out of the West Indies Federation. That federation would last for 4 years. It came to an end in 1962 when Jamaica held a referendum asking whether Jamaica could remain in the federation or not. By a narrow margin, the Jamaicans voted against staying in the federation, and it came to an end. Walter Rodney campaigned for that federation. He was a university student in Jamaica during the period of the federation. And so Walter Rodney, in a sense, grew up with the decolonization movement, the movement to bring a final end to colonialism. It was the first generation of scholars and students that were bred by the Caribbean. The University of the West Indies came into effect in 1948, the first university in our part of the world. And so we had a generation of young men and women who would go to that university, getting a native education. These young men and women were not being educated in a colonial framework. They were being educated in an independent framework. At the turn of the 50s, when the first iteration of what we now know as reggae music sprung up in Jamaica in the form of ska, Walter Rodney would have been 8 or 9 at that time. So he would have been growing up with ska music, with the early reggae music, which would later become rocksteady, then reggae, and today it's known as dancehall. It was in 1950 in England when the West Indies cricket team would for the first time defeat England on its own soil, beating the English in their backyard in a game that was created by them to manners the colonists. The famous victory would lead the Lord Kitchener and others to sing calypsos. We all remember cricket, lovely cricket at Lord's where I saw it. Ramadan and Valentine, those two pals of mine. Walter Rodney grew up with that. And so the Walter Rodney generation grew up with independence. And just as in cricket, we were asking questions and making demands. We know of the demands of CLR James in the late 50s, that the West Indies cricket team be captained by a black man. Prior to that, black men were playing for the cricket team, but could not captain it. It was always reserved for a white man. And so in cricket, we were asking questions. We were saying we were becoming politically independent. And so we should also be independent in cricket, and a black man must captain the team. So Frank Worrell, Barbadian, would become the first full-time Black West Indies captain as he embarked for Jamaica. There was a note in his pocket from CLR James that says, if we triumph in Australia, we will prove to the world that we're ready to govern ourselves. So we were asking, what would our independence be in cricket? What would our independence be in culture? The 1950s was the rise of the great West Indian novelists, George Lamin, Samuel Selvon, V.S. Naipaul, Guyana's own Edgar Metherholzer. Louise Bennett, Jamaica Labrish, writing poems in Creolese, in Patois, our own Wordsworth McAndrew. Old woman with the wrinkled skin, let the old light walk begin. Put on your fiery disguise, old woman with the weary eyes, shed your swizzly skin. Those of us who know about the old eye. Walter Rodney is growing up in that generation. And it is that generation that after Jamaica and Trinidad began its independence in 1962, Guyana and Barbados followed in 1966. That generation would obviously have an interest in what that independence would look like. Walter Rodney would have been 19 years old when the racial disturbances started in Guyana. That would last from 61 to 64 as Indians and Africans fought over who should govern Guyana after the British left. A bloody period in our history. It was the period of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States of America fought it out. Who would control the world? Whose economic system, socialism or capitalism, will govern the world? It was the period of the civil rights movement in America, spurred in 1954, when Emmett Till, young black boy from Chicago, was murdered in Money, Mississippi, because he said, "Hi, baby," to a white woman. He was killed and his body was thrown to the bottom of the Mississippi River. That event would spur the Black Power movement, because the civil rights movement, because shortly after that, a woman, Rosa Parks, would refuse to go to the back of the bus. And those two events sparking the modern civil rights movement. Dr. King, a young 26-year-old preacher, barely, as we would say in Guyana, barely losing his mother's features, was pushed to the leadership of a movement that would last 11 years. Walter Rodney was 12 years in 1954 when Emmett Till was lynched and when Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. It was a period in world history that was pregnant with activism. That civil rights movement would bring into being the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which gave African Americans equal citizenship in America for the first time. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that would give African Americans the right to vote, bringing them in line with the 15th Amendment of the American Constitution. It was 1964-65 that will open the doors for lots of West Indians to migrate to America. My own mother migrated in 1969 because the victory of African Americans in winning their citizenship and their right to vote opened the doors for others, other people of color, other Black people to come to America. I think my mother's in the audience, and she was part of that wave, leaving Guyana to come to America. It was because of the victory of the civil rights movement and the wave of West Indians coming to America. Walter Rodney's growing up with all of that, all of that. The Black Power movement launched in the United States when in 1966, after being tear gassed by police in a schoolyard during a march, Stokely Carmichael took the mic and said, "After tonight, all scared niggas are dead. What do we want?" And the crowd roared, "Black Power. What do we want? Black Power." The Black Power movement was born. Stokely Carmichael later became known as Kwame Ture, became the voice of that movement. Carmichael had migrated from Trinidad and Tobago to join his mother and father in the United States, born in 1941, just as Rodney was born in 1942. That generation leading the movement. And then 3 years later, Walter Rodney would graduate from university and go to Jamaica to teach African history. And he was prevented from teaching African history at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, a country that was and is 90% Black, being denied the right to learn African history in its university. Rodney would then go to the streets and street corners and the gullies in Jamaica and teach African history. He developed the following. And then he left to go to a writers' conference in Montreal, Canada in October of 1968. And when he got back in Jamaica, the Jamaican government banned him from landing in Jamaica. His crime that he was teaching African history, he was grounding with the brothers and sisters in the downtrodden areas, the Rastafarians. And when he was banned in October 1968, and word got around Jamaica, the students, led by Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, who is now Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, he was then a student. And he was the head of the Students' Guild. And he led a march that included the late Patrick Manning, Prime Minister of Trinidad, Dr. Peter Phillips, who was recently the leader of the People's National Party in Jamaica. Other Guyanese and Caribbean students of the day were in that march. And they marched from the university to downtown Kingston to the Prime Minister's office to ask why Rodney, this young 26-year-old Guyanese. Dr. King was 26 when he was called upon to lead the movement. Walter Rodney is 26 when he's banned from Jamaica. And as the students are marching this, they notice a crowd in the opposite direction. They didn't know what that crowd was about. But as they got to the four corners, they realized it was a crowd of young men and women from the inner city, from the ghettos in Kingston. They were marching because they heard Walter Rodney was banned. And this crowd of students, the unemployed youth, the Rastafarians, the workers, would together march to the Prime Minister's office. The police would intervene. People were beaten and killed. There was rioting. Those events became known later on as the Rodney riots. And it was that event that spurred the birth of the Black Power movement in the English-speaking Caribbean. Stokely Carmichael spurring the birth in America, a Trinidadian born in 1941. Walter Rodney spurring the birth in the Caribbean, a Guyanese born in 1942. There's a generation that is asking questions. Those students would leave the university and go back to their respective countries, and they all would form Black Power organizations. In Guyana, we already had ASCRIA, which was the first English-speaking Caribbean Black Power organization that was born before the Black Power movement in 1964, founded by the then Sidney King, who would later change his name to EUC Guyana. And these Black Power organizations would demand that our independence reflect the images and the culture and the empowerment of Black people. We had independence, but Black people could not work in banks. We had independence, but Black people could not access jobs and education. We had independence, but Black history could not be taught in our universities. We had independence, but Black people could not go to Queen's College and Bishop's High School in Guyana. And this generation was asking, what does independence mean without Black power? We had independence, but the power was still held in the hands of the tiny white and brown elites. And so the Black Power movement was asking questions of independence. By 1970, university students at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad would now take the streets and ask questions. If we are free as a Black West Indian and a brown West Indian nation, why Jesus is still portrayed as a white man in our churches? Why the Shango and the Baptists and the Jordanites and the Rastafarians were still being criminalized, were still being marginalized in an independent Caribbean? And they would take to the streets in Trinidad and Tobago. The soldiers would rise up, and there was a mutiny in the army in Trinidad and Tobago. The students would march into the countryside and bring East Indians into the movement. Eric Williams, who was the Prime Minister of Trinidad, Dr. Eric Williams, would have written the seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery, which is still the greatest economic thesis of slavery. Eric Williams was Prime Minister of Trinidad. And the students were saying, you radicalized us with capitalism and slavery. You later wrote a history of the West Indies from Columbus to Castro. And now you're a leader. Why are you not transforming the Caribbean? Why are you not transforming Trinidad and Tobago? The government almost fell. American warships were waiting off the coast of Venezuela to enter had the Black Power activists taken over. The government would crack down on the activists, jailing them. Some of them went into the hills and they were killed. They passed a draconian sedition bill in which you could not criticize the Trinidadian government. It was called the Sedition Bill, prompting a young mighty Chogdus to sing the famous calypso, Afraid Carl, afraid the sedition bill, afraid the seditioner. Like my friends, them don't understand. They want to jail my backside. But I'm singing about that because what? Afraid Carl, afraid the seditioner. And that action by the Trinidadian government set a train in the Caribbean where governments were beginning to see their young activists as a threat. And so there was born this competition, this argument as to what independence should be. All the leaders like Eric Williams were arguing that we should just reform the Caribbean. And the younger men and women, Walter Rodney of Guyana, Tim Hector in Antigua, George Odlum in St. Lucia, Maurice Bishop in Jamaica, Trevor Monroe, Maurice Bishop in Grenada, sorry, Trevor Monroe in Jamaica. These are a few names of the leaders of that time. They were saying there must be a revolution, a complete transformation, a complete break with colonialism. So we had these two views of independence. The view of the older leaders that we must go slowly and we must reform. And the view of the younger men and women that we must make a clean break. Cuba, which in 1959 had made a clean break by launching a revolution, an armed revolution that got rid of the Batista government in Cuba, wrestled Cuba away from the clutches of America and others. The young men and women saw Cuba as the model. And so, to understand Walter Rodney, you have to understand that argument over what independence should be. And it did push some of the leaders to take more progressive positions. In Jamaica, Michael Manley, who took over from his father, Norman Manley, in 1972 came to power and proclaimed democratic socialism, which according to him would uproot poverty and give the ordinary working people a chance to become fully part of Jamaica. He would remove the stain from the Rastafarians and bring them into the mainstream of Caribbean society, Jamaican society. Manley comes to power in 1972. Bob Marley is rising to become a superstar. In 1973, Bob Marley and the Wailers would release their first album. 1972, Jimmy Cliff will release the first reggae album, Wonderful World, Beautiful People. 1972, the first Jamaican and Caribbean film on the Caribbean, about the Caribbean, with Caribbean actors. Jimmy Cliff would be the star in that film, The Harder They Come. And the tracks from his album, Wonderful World, Beautiful People, would be the track in that movie. Songs such as The Harder They Come, The Harder They Fall, Wonderful World, Beautiful People, Many Rivers to Cross, Suffering in the Land. Michael Manley comes to power in 1972. All of that is happening in 1972, 73 in Jamaica. The rise of the modern reggae, protest music. Sisters and brothers, I'm giving this history so that you can better understand what is this Walter Rodney thing about. After being banned from Jamaica, Walter Rodney spent a few months in Cuba, and then he went to teach in Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam. And while he was there, he wrote a book that is now the most famous history book about Africa, a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Rodney argues in that book that the underdevelopment of Africa came about because of the development of Europe. He went back in history to the point where Europe was underdeveloped, and it was Africa that was developed. And that with the coming of European colonialism and the stealing of the wealth of Africa, Europe became developed, Africa became underdeveloped. He argues in that book that we do not drain a continent of 80 million of its people through the transatlantic slave trade and expect that continent to be developed. That book changed the way African history was being written and interpreted. That is why it's a seminal book. From then to now, the interpretation of African history changed. Prior to that, it was white people who were writing African history and who were arguing that Africa was underdeveloped because its people lacked the capacity to develop a nation. Walter Rodney changed that single-handedly. While in Tanzania, he would go on the front lines where the freedom fighters who were fighting against apartheid in South African Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia, and Namibia, and where they were fighting wars of independence in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. And he would go on the front line with those soldiers and teach them African history. He would go into the battlefield with those soldiers fighting against apartheid and teaching them African history and African economics. I'm giving this history for you to understand who and what is Walter Rodney on this June 13th. In Guyana, Walter Rodney has become wrapped up in the simple politics between the PNC and the PPP and the WPA. And what it does, it robs Guyanese of knowing who this man is, was, and what he represents. To some PNC people, he's a devil. To some PPP people, he is a convenient hero. For the WPA, he's a hero. And the question, what is he to Guyana? Walter Rodney would leave Africa in 1974 to come back home to his Guyana, which he had left in 1960 when he left to go to the University of the West Indies. He had been away for 14 years. He had contributed to the Black Power struggle in Jamaica. He had contributed to the anti-imperialist and anti-apartheid struggle in Jamaica. And he argued that it's okay to make change in somebody else's country, but your responsibility is to make change in your own country. And convinced by his young colleague, Professor Clive Thomas, who was also teaching in Tanzania and who was also banned from Jamaica. Clive Thomas managed to convince Rodney that he should come back to Guyana. He applied to the University of Guyana to be named the head of the history department. He got the job. And with his young wife and 3 children, little children, he prepared to come back home to his country. But what was happening in Guyana in 1974? Like Michael Manley, Forbes Burnham, who had taken over the government as head of a coalition with his PNC and the United Force. Like Michael Manley, Burnham answered the call of Black Power and introduced some very progressive social reforms in the first decade of independence. He had nationalized the commanding heights of the economy, bringing them into local hands owned by the state of Guyana on behalf of the people of Guyana. He had nationalized sugar, had nationalized bauxite. He was introducing free education from nursery to university. He had embarked on a housing project that would see the rise of housing schemes. Melanie, but before that, what is now called South Georgetown. He would later democratize the education system to make it easier for poor people, children, to go to Queen's College and Bishops and Saints and St. Roses and St. Joseph. His foreign policy was perhaps one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive, in the so-called third world. He had supported anti-apartheid struggles in Africa. Guyana making monetary contributions to the freedom fighters. He would support non-alignment, arguing that small countries should be aligned neither to the West nor the East. And he became a leading voice in the non-aligned movement. It was the group of 77 in the United Nations that argued and advocated for the cause of third world liberation. Guyana was a leading voice. Burnham and his government's voice was one of the leading voices in the call for a new world economic order, a new world information order. The Burnham domestic policy and its foreign policy was one of the most progressive in the third world. But by 1974, this very progressive Burnham government, to the surprise of many, would announce the doctrine of the paramountcy of the party, arguing that his party, the PNC, was above the government and state of Guyana. The party was paramount to the state. Soon we saw the flag of the PNC being flown above the Supreme Court. The paramountcy of the party saw the party office was located not at Congress Place, but within the Ministry of National Mobilization. Dr. Reed headed, he was the General Secretary, and his ministry was called the Office of the General Secretary of the PNC and the Ministry of National Mobilization, merging the party with the government in the state. So here was this government implementing the most progressive domestic economic agenda, and with one of the most progressive foreign policy in the third world. But when it comes to the management of power, he's faltering. Eric Williams faltered. Eric Gary faltered. Eric Gary would create a mongoose gang that he would set loose on the young men and women in the Black Power movement that later became the New Jewel movement, killing the father of Maurice Bishop in a demonstration. Patrick John in Dominica will go down the same road. Verboord in Antigua would go down the same road. Robert Bradshaw in St. Kitts and Nevis will go down the same road. Michael Manley took another road. He did not tamper with the state in the same way as the others. Errol Barrow in Barbados did not do it. They were the exceptions. But all the other leaders in the English-speaking Caribbean, when faced with dissent in their own countries, chose to weaponize the state against their own opponents, the opponents in their own country. And it was in that context that Walter Rodney came back to Guyana. Before he landed, the government rescinded his appointment at the University of Guyana. Under the guise that he was dangerous. It was that act that set Rodney in opposition to the PNC government. In 1974, the Working People's Alliance was formed, an alliance of Iusi Quayanas Askria, Moses Bhagwan IPRA, the Indian People's Revolutionary Associates. Brindley Benz, Working People's Vanguard Party. Brindley Ben was the former deputy leader of the PPP. He's the father of Robeson Ben. And Ratoon, a group at the University of Guyana led by Clive Thomas and Jasper Ramsamy and others. These four organizations came together in 1974 to form the Working People's Alliance. Brindley Ben's Working People's Vanguard Party would leave within the first year or so. Walter Rodney comes back to Guyana. He's denied work at the University of Guyana. He tried to get a job to teach in the high schools. He was denied. His wife was denied the right to work. Rodney joins the WPA. Later on, he would convince his friends, Rupert Rupnarayan and Andaye, to come back home and join the WPA. They came back in 1977. That then was the stage for the struggle between the WPA and the PNC in the 1970s. It was the same struggle between the New Jewel movement led by Maurice Bishop and the Gary government in Grenada. It was the same struggle between the brothers and sisters in the Democratic movement in Dominica, who would clash with the Patrick John government. It was the same clash between Tim Hector's Antigua Caribbean Liberation Movement and the Byrd government. It was the same struggle and clash between the progressive wing of the St. Lucia Labour Party led by George Odlum and the John Compton government. And saying that what was happening in Guyana was not isolated to Guyana. The 1970s was a period of revolution, where the revolutionaries in the individual countries were clashing with their fathers and mothers in the governments over what should independence mean and what should it be. Walter Rodney would make the battle cry, people's power, no dictatorship, arguing that you cannot build a socialist and progressive society with a dictatorship. That clash would lead to the murder of Walter Rodney in 1980. The clash in Grenada would lead to revolution in 1979 that ended in 1983 with the murder of Maurice Bishop and the invasion of Grenada. That clash would lead to the ousting of Patrick John from power in Dominica. That clash would see in Antigua Tim Hector being persecuted, eventually his wife was murdered. I am arguing that the roaring 70s, as Brother Valentino put it, the roaring 70s was a testing period for our Caribbean. Rodney's life was taken away in that struggle. It was famously said, two Daddy Crapo can't live in the same house. Mr. Burnham was accused to have said that. Mr. Burnham told the WPA, make your wills. Let's be frank. This was a question of which of the two tendencies will govern Guyana. In those days, there were no attempts at reconciliation. We are told later on that some behind the scenes moves were made to bring together Rodney and Burnham, but it was scuttled by some people who were close to Burnham. It was a zero-sum struggle, and Rodney was murdered, he was assassinated. The struggle continued after that. The WPA continued to build as a party. It joined an alliance with the PPP, a broad alliance with the PPP and other forces who were opposed to dictatorship. By the time Mr. Burnham died in 1985, he had begun to look for new avenues to bring the parties together. He had launched a power sharing initiative in the PPP. He died, and Mr. Hoyt, Desmond Hoyt, who took over, he removed some of the authoritarian structures. He permitted the birth of a newspaper, an independent newspaper. The Stabroek News came out of that Hoyt pulling back of the authoritarian state. Mr. Hoyt would open up the economy from a socialist commandist economy to an open economy. By 1992, free and fair elections had returned. The PNC was voted out and the PPP was voted in. Now, the question of Walter Rodney remained. In 1988, after pressure from the WPA, the Hoyt government held an inquest. Witnesses were not called. The chief witness, Gregory Smith, who gave Walter Rodney a walkie-talkie, which turned out to be a bomb that killed Rodney. It was now established that Gregory Smith was working at the behest of the top leadership of the government, and he was now living in French Guyana. But he did not come back to give evidence in the inquest. Walter Rodney's brother, Donald Rodney, who was in the car with him, was not summoned to give evidence before the inquest. The inquest found that Rodney had died of misadventure. But at least Hoyt had held an inquest. It was an advance. The PPP took power in 1992 and vowed that, before that it vowed that it wanted justice for Walter Rodney. 1 year later, it did nothing. Walter Rodney's young son, who was then 26 or 27, living in Barbados, came to Guyana and picketed the office of the president, demanding that the PPP honor its promise to hold an independent inquiry into Rodney's murder. Mr. Jagan came out and told the young boy to go home. Dr. Jagan asked What will an inquiry do? What will an inquiry show? You see, the PPP, when Walter Rodney was murdered, shared the view that he was murdered because he wanted to put in place the violent overthrow of the government. Dr. Jagan famously said, Walter Rodney promised you a Christmas present and you all get his head on a platter. He died because he was an ultra-leftist, an adventurist, the PPP. Let's fast forward. This past week, the PPP announced that it will change Walter Rodney's death to that of assassination. It will put his books in schools. It will make his gravesite a national monument. These are all wonderful things. But this is not 2021. It's not the first time the PPP got power. It got power in 1992. This is almost 30 years later. What have you been doing in 30 years? I know. Why no? In 1992, Dr. Jagan said, what will an inquiry show? Mr. Jagan told the young boy to go home. They weren't interested in justice for Walter Rodney. When the French asked the Guyana government under Jerry Jagan to give a guarantee that if Gregory Smith were to be brought back to Guyana to face a murder charge for Rodney's murder, that he would not be given the death penalty because France does not have the death penalty and it would not extradite someone to a country that had the death penalty. The PPP failed to give the French government that undertaking, and so Gregory Smith was never extradited. Then in 2005, the WPA held a big event in Guyana to mark the 25th anniversary of Rodney's death, sorry. His wife came back to Guyana for the first time in 25 years with his children. And they agreed that they would hold an inquiry. The WPA approached the PNC under Robert Corbyn. And Robert Corbyn said yes. And the PPP said yes. And the PPP agreed to table a motion in Parliament. The motion in the table said that it would be an inquiry into the assassination of Walter Rodney. The WPA pointed out it has to be an inquiry into the murder to determine whether it's an assassination. You don't have an inquiry when you already come to the conclusion that it's an assassination. And the WPA argued that assassination should come out. And the PNC said they will vote for the motion once assassination came out. And you know what? The PNC voted for the motion. The WPA then, with a seat in Parliament, voted for the motion, and the PPP abstained on its own motion. You heard that? You want an inquiry for Rodney, but you abstain on your own motion because of the word assassination. Now, those of us in the WPA believe Rodney was assassinated, but our argument, like I said, was if we want to find out the cause of death, we can proclaim it before the inquiry, sorry. The motion was carried, however, and then it was time for the terms of reference, and the WPA and the PPP could not agree on those terms. And so the idea of an inquiry died. The WPA had also said that they did not want an inquiry before the 2006 election because they did not want the inquiry to become a political football. And the family, Rodney family, agreed with that. But as I said, there was disagreement over the terms of reference. And so that inquiry died, never happened. And then, out of the blues, in 2013, 2014, the Ramatar government announced that it was approached by the Rodney family for an inquiry. And they said that the Rodney family said they should not consult with the WPA. The Rodney family later on denied this. But our position that even if the family said that you should not consult the WPA and the PNC, you as the government have to make the decision. The Rodney family is not the government. So the inquiry became a PPP inquiry. Nevertheless, the WPA participated, not as a party, it released its individuals, the individual members, to give evidence. The point I'm making here is that the inquiry was done by the Ramatar government, which was a minority government, because at the 2011 election, the APNU and the AFC together got the majority in the National Assembly. And the PPP remained in power only because our constitution says that once the president has a plurality, he can be president, or once a party gets a plurality, even if it doesn't have a majority, that party's presidential candidate became the president. It was a minority presidency, a minority government, and they wanted something to bolster themselves, and they seized on the request by the Rodney family. But there was an inquiry. As we know, the PPP was defeated at the 2015 election, and the coalition came to power. The WPA was part of that coalition. From beginning in 2006, the WPA and the PNC have begun to talk about a partnership. WPA was approached by Robert Corbyn, and Robert Corbyn, Clive Thomas and Rupert Roopnaraine, they began to craft that partnership. There were two warring factions, as I outlined earlier in this broadcast. There were two warring factions. WPA's leader was killed at the direction of the PNC government. But yet these two warring parties came together and said, let's bury the hatchet in the interest of national reconciliation. For us in the WPA, we were very clear. Very clear. You cannot have national reconciliation in Guyana without the PPP and the PNC. How on earth are you going to do that? One of them represents a major ethnic group, the other one represents the other major ethnic group. Together they represent over 90% of the electorate. How on earth are you going to have national reconciliation without them? WPA was a partner with the PPP. We fought against the PNC ever. When the PPP won power in 1992, it did not include the WPA in its government. Jagan told the WPA leaders, I don't have enough jobs for the boys. Throw WPA by the wayside. And when Jagan died, the young men and women in his party took Guyana in the same direction that the PNC took it in the 1970s. And in the interest of national wholeness and national reconciliation, the WPA felt that if we can join with the PNC, it will send a signal to Guyana that we can unite as a country. That if the PPP sees this, they will join and we will solve this nonsense of ethnic division. We in the WPA knew we were going to be beaten up for that. Some of our members didn't want it. Some of them cried physically. But most of us agree that it was the right thing to do. We cannot have Black liberation in America if the followers of Dr. King and the followers of Malcolm X don't come together. The Black Lives Movement have all the Black tendencies. If there's going to be peace in the Middle East, the Palestinians and Israelis will have to come together. In the rest of the Caribbean, the old revolutionaries are now in the two big parties that they fought against. Timecta in Antigua merged its ACLM with the UPP. Look across the Caribbean. Trevor Monroe, the leader of the Workers' Party of Jamaica, the Communist Party, joined the PNP. The left-wing parties were demolished after the Grenada debacle. And most of them went into mainstream politics and parties. WPA did not join another party. We joined with another party to create a partnership. Our difference with the PNC remained. The PNC's differences with us remained. But we were united on one thing, that Guyana had to be saved from the criminalized state that the PPP had pushed Guyana into. The underworld had taken over Guyana. Young Black men, 400 and none of them were killed. More than Burnham ever killed. Black people working people were being demolished by the PPP. A minority of Indians left the PPP and formed and joined the AFC. It was not only us in the WPA who felt that the PPP had pushed Guyana to the very edge. And so it was in the context of national reconciliation and saving our country from demise that we joined with the PNC. It was Corbyn who was the PNC leader who formed that alliance, the APNU. The name APNU was coined by the WPA. We were committed to coalition. And when power came, what happened? Mr. Granger took over. He was not part of building the APNU. In fact, he was preparing in 2011 to go to an election as PNC. Wasn't preparing as no APNU. He's not a coalitionist. But he was the leader of the PNC, and the coalition took power. And from day one, he marginalized the WPA, gave them one ministry. People like myself, he wanted nowhere near government. Felt I was too radical, and some of us in the WPA were too, didn't want us in his government. But one of the first things he did was to close down the Walter Rodney inquiry. Never called us to the table and asked us what we think, what should be done. He did it without consulting us, and we are partners. Our leader, there's a commission of inquiry, and you closed that thing down. Embarrassed us. You are in a government in which your slain leader, there's an inquiry into his death, his murder, and the government in your name closes it down. Granger is crazy. But he did it. And then to rub salt in the wounds, when the inquiry was debated in Parliament, they voted against releasing the inquiry or implementing recommendations. How do you treat your partner like that? It's like a man and a woman marrying, and the man decide that the woman's father will be persecuted and he will be part of it. Come on. WPA stayed in the government. We stayed. We stayed because we felt that the people had voted for a coalition government. And if we left, we would be insulting those people. We didn't want to be a Charandas, so we stayed. Charandas later did what he did. We didn't do that. We stayed despite what was done to us. Dr. Rupnarain was demoted from Minister of Education to a small department called the Public Service. Mr. Granger never called the WP and said, I'm thinking of moving Rupert. What do you all think? He did it on his own. Came into the country, drove to Rupert's residence in Mahika and tell Rupert, I'm demoting you. And then call Desmond Tracton afterwards and say, I am demoting your leader. He didn't use the word demote. He said, I am moving Rupert, but it was demotion. We stayed. We stayed. Despite all of that. When the elections were over, we left because we could take no more. I noticed there are a lot of stupid talk on thing about thing. Look, the occasion for us leaving was who should represent the WPA in Parliament. Mr. Granger gave us one seat. We wanted to split that seat between two members, one serving half of the term, the other one serving half of the term. If they'd given us two, we would have divided that two also between two people. Instead of Mr. Granger calling us and saying, I'm giving you all one seat, who do you all want to fill that seat? Which is what happens in a coalition. And we would have said, here are two people. One will serve the first 2.5 years, the other will serve. No, he didn't do that. He chose the WPA member who he thinks should represent the WPA. And we have to say, go to hell. You eyes pass us. And we walk. You've been taking your eyes past us for 5 years. And we stayed not because of you, but because of keeping the government that the people voted for. Now that government is gone, partly because of you, and we are gone. Guyanese people must know the facts. And then he came a few weeks ago and said the WPA left because they wanted to grab power. And so we had to respond to him. WPA grabbing power? People tell us we're stupid because we don't like power. You all know people tell me, oh, Dr. Hines, come home and take over the party, take over the government. I am not driven by that because I don't come from that culture. I'm not driven by power. The WPA is not driven by power. We are driven by service. And for Mr. Granger to say that we left because because of power, nonsense. We left because of the way we were treated. So when the PPP comes now and said it will do all these things to Rodney, the PPP is just trying to score political points. The PPP wants to take over the legacy of Rodney. But the PPP can't take over the legacy of Rodney. When Rodney was alive, the PPP would run for cover. When we in the WPA were in the streets facing the guns and the goons, and we invite the PPP to send a speaker to our meetings, none of them wanted to come in, including Jagan. One person was Moses Nagamutu. He was the only PPP member who would come onto the WPA platform in the 70s. He was not a coward like the rest of them who are today talking about Rodney. And they ran from Rodney when he was alive. Where Rodney and the rest of us, including this speaker, there's the guns, went to jail, got shot, got killed, some of us. Where were the PPP? And now you are telling us was betraying Rodney? We stood with Rodney in life. Where were you? Even when Rodney died, and it was blasphemous to call his name, the WPA called his name. Young men and women, Karen D'Souza, Wazim Mohammed, Nigel Westmus, David Hines, and others gave up our youth. Give up our youth. We lived in poverty to stand with Rodney and to tell you, the PPP, are telling us about betraying Rodney. Go to hell. Betraying Rodney? You come now, you will do this, you will do that, you will do the other for Rodney because you want to put a wedge between Rodney and the WPA. You want to put a wedge between Rodney and black people. All Rodney fight for is free and fair elections. That's what you always say. Go read what Rodney wrote. Go listen to his speeches. He hardly mentioned free and fair election. He had more sense to realize that you can have free and fair election. And that's what we have now. So-called free and fair elections and a goddamn dictatorship under the people. Rodney knew better. Rodney said what he wanted to remove was dictatorship. And you are now pulling his name into your nonsense about free and fair election because you want to use the mantra of free and fair election to grab powers you did last year. Now, if our government is going to do the things that the PPP said it will do, we will not say no, but we will separate the things from the authors. We'll separate the things from the authors. We will separate the things from the authors. A cause of death is murder. The nature of the murder is assassination. The PPP said that they will change and put assassination on the birth certificate. Well, that's their load to lift. We know that Rodney was assassinated. We know he was murdered because of his political activism, and that is assassination. And we are not going to get into the argument about whether assassination is cause of death and all of that. Let the PPP work that out. We want Rodney's book in schools, yes. But don't believe that you will put Rodney book in school and then the next day you put Adam book and you put Abdio book. That is the trick they're aiming for. And we are going to be vigilant. You're not going to use Rodney to get your view of Guyana's history into our curriculum to mess up our young people's minds. That's the plan. The PPP has destroyed Guyana, and it is seeking to destroy Rodney. They're putting a wedge between Rodney and black people. I learned my black power from Rodney. I learned my Pan-Africanism from Rodney. Go read Rumbles with my brothers and sisters. He was more black than me and Lincoln Lewis and Eric Phillips and Vincent Alexander. But you are pretending that he's not a black man. Multiracial. Rodney was very clear that you can only be multiracial if you believe in your racial heritage. You all want to know, put him at war with black people. David Hines betrayed Walter Rodney because all David Rice talked about black. Rodney talked about black all his life. You all want to hide that from the Guyanese people. And so, sisters and brothers, on this June 13th, I want to hail my brother Walter Rodney and urge you to do the same. There is something in Walter Rodney for all Guyanese. His books, Locked Me Out of India, to be read by all Indian children. Kofi Badu Out of Africa should be read by all African children, and both books should be read by all children. Those who want history, you can learn from his history books, History of Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1905. Brilliant treatise. If you're a black powerist, you get that from him. Part of him was that. If you believe in revolution, you get that. There's a piece of Rodney for all Guyanese. We had the unfortunate period in Guyana and the Caribbean when the radicals and the reformists clashed. murder occurred that should not have been occurred, should not have occurred. But we have to pick up the pieces as a nation. And we are not going to allow the PPP to use Rodney to divide Guyana further. That's what they want to do. That's what they want to do. So on this June 13th, I implore all of you in the audience and out of the audience, let us bury the hatchet. Let us bury the hatchet in the interest of our children, our grandchildren. My party has left the coalition, but we have not left the struggle. That the coalition is part of. My party has left the coalition, but it is not seeking a fight with the coalition. If the coalition believes in wresting Guyana from foreign intervention, we are there with you. If the coalition believes in a Guyana for Guyanese, we are there with you. If the coalition believes that part of the oil money must go to the Guyanese people in the form of cash in their hands, we are there with you. If the coalition believes in electoral reform and constitutional reform that will see a new voters list that is not padded with the dead and those who have migrated, we are there with you. If the coalition believes that Guyana belongs to Black people too, we are there with you. If the coalition believes that we must not go down on our knees and fight the PPP, but we must stand direct and confront their evilness, we are there with you. If the coalition believes in a coalition in which all partners are treated with equal respect and are given tasks to fit their strengths, we are there with you. If the coalition believes each party must choose who represented in the coalition, we are there with you. Coalition believes that the working people of Guyana deserves a living wage, whether they are public servants or cane cutters, cane harvesters, we are there with you. If the coalition believes that the people at the Guyana Water Authority, those workers, have the same rights as the workers at Gaisuko, we are there with you. If the coalition is not afraid to defend Black people who voted for them overwhelmingly, if they're not afraid to stand up and raise the banner defending our Black sisters and brothers, we are there with you. Sisters and brothers, we are at a serious time. The PPP is again on the rampage. They want to use our brother Walter Rodney to hide. But if it's the last breath that I, David Hines, have in my body, I will fight that. Those of you who are PNC supporters will have to live with the history. Your party of that time killed my leader. I cannot stop saying that. I cannot sweep that under the carpet. But it does not mean that I cannot work with you and ground with you in the interest of my country. You did not murder Rodney. Some of you, most of you, are not born. Think of it. Think of it. If you were born in 1980, you're today 41 years old. You are not responsible for Rodney's death. If you were 18 years in 1980, today, you're 59 years old. They're old people and young people who were born or came of age after Rodney was murdered. You should not carry that burden. It is that generation, some of them who are still alive, who could work that out. Those in the PNC, those in the WPA, and those in the PPP. As I said, the Corbyn PNC and the WPA had begun to work it out. Unfortunately, Mr. Granger's PNC did not finish the job. And so the PPP today can come in and take advantage of that mistake. I say here, I don't know Corbyn very well. Corbyn has his history in the PNC. I remember as a young man going with Rodney to Linden and seeing Corbyn in Linden with the troops. But it was Corbyn who opened the possibility for the PNC and WPA to reconcile. And I can say that had Corbyn become president in 2015, he would not have closed down the inquiry. I don't think so. The relations between the WPA and the PNC would have been better today. We might still have been in government, and the PPP would not have been pampesetting as they did. Yes, we, the WPA, have to take our fair share of responsibility in a fight. It takes two to tango. We didn't murder anybody. We didn't assassinate anybody. But we were involved in a conflict. And we recognized a long time ago that we have to accept and own up to our role in that conflict. And we feel that the best way to heal that conflict is to come together despite our differences. Despite our differences. And we hope the new leadership that will take over the PNC recognizes the importance of healing this breach. If the breach between the WPA and the PNC can be healed, Guyana can be healed. It was the WPA and the PNC coming together that brought the AFC in for the coalition to win in 2015. The AFC would not have touched the PNC by itself. So, Walter Rodney lives. Don't hate him because your party back then hated him. He's a Guyanese. Anywhere in the world you go, the first name you call, they will say Walter Rodney. He transcended Guyana. He's Guyana's gift to itself, to the Caribbean, to Africa, to the progressive world, to the Black world. And we have to protect him from the vultures at Freedom House, who want to take him and destroy him and make him unrecognizable to those of us who stood with him. I am proud. As a teenager, I heard him When I was 15, he came to Buxton. I went home, I told my auntie Cecilia, auntie, brother UC bring a man. And he talked to me tonight, and I like what I hear, and I want to join. And my auntie said, once teacher Sydney, as they call brother UC in Buxton, our generation, she said, once teacher Sydney is part of it, you can join. And that's how I joined. I was 15 years old. I was there with Rodney. I was there reciting Martin Carter's poem, "This is my hand for the revolution." That night, there will be thousands of torches. Karen D'Souza and I used to say poems and chants before these big speakers came on to speak. We were the poets, the chantwells. That night, there'll be thousands of torches from the hospital. The lame will come. Those who are mad will become sane for the revolution. And I myself will be so fiercely happy that I'll make my shirt a banner for the revolution. And the guns were there, the bombs were there. And as a young teenager, I stood with Rodney. And you are telling me now that I betray Rodney? My mother, every day, every night, lived in fear that she will get the news that her son, my other brother George, she had 2 sons, that she will get a telegram in those days saying that her sons have died. And you are now telling me about betrayal of Rodney? And God, people like me have lived. Rodney died, but we lived. I teach in a university now because of the example of Rodney. I'm able to speak today because of the example of Rodney. He was not a coward. He taught me and others not to be cowards. Not to be cowards. And you want to tell me that I'm a scoundrel because I sit down with my countrymen and women of another party to search for peace for my country? Walter Rodney lives. Tonight at 7 p.m. join us, 6 p.m. Join us because we are going to have a panel discussion with Professor Clive Thomas and David. I noticed my friend Donald Ramatar is in the audience. Donald, how you doing, boy? You know what I'm talking about? You are there. You are one. Donald, you are one of the different ones because you are there. And I talk to you just as I talk to the PNC people because I consider you a friend. And you have a role to play on your side in rescuing the legacy of Walter Rodney. That's Donald Ramatar, former president of Guyana, in the audience. He's my friend. I don't make any secret about that. I knew Donald Ramatar when I was a little boy, going to Freedom House, being part of Workers Stage, a PPP drama group led by Gail Teixeira. I knew, and regardless of our differences, we have remained friends. He has my number, he calls me whenever I call him. We disagree politically, but not as human beings. I was saying tonight at 6 o'clock, a symposium, Professor Thomas and David Patterson, I will moderate, and we'll talk about the gas to shore pipeline on this Rodney anniversary. I gotta go now, because I gotta go on the radio program in Antigua. I have another program in London, and I have one in the United States. And then I have to be with Norman Brown on his program from England. It's a busy day for me, a busy day for Rodney. But I will do what I have to do on this day. I will scream my voice to tell the story of Walter Rodney. And tonight, I shall have a long, deep sleep, knowing that I've done what is required of me to keep the real name of Walter Rodney alive. So thank you all for tuning in. There was lots of emotions today. I'm very emotional. My mother is in this audience, and I know what I put her through. I put her through because of my political involvement. And up to today, I'm an old man, big man, and I still put my family through that. And it hurts when people try to tell you about betrayal. All right. We're going to be all right. Walter Rodney lives. Thanks. Mr. Operator?